We love supporting and promoting the creators of musical theater throughout the world, and we would love to have your support as well. Go to musicaltheaterradio.com and click on the Become a Patron button, because a supportive community is a strong community.
Welcome back to another episode of Be Our Guest here on Musical Theater Radio. I am your host, as always, Jean-Paul Yovanoff. We are heading back to the UK for today's guest, and we're going to be talking about the musical theater scene over there. What's been going on in this crazy year and anything else that happens to pop into our mind. I want to welcome to the show today, Mark Shenton. Mark, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thank you very much for coming on today.
It's a great pleasure.
Awesome.
I'm a massive musical theatre enthusiast and fan and critic. So this is my life. It is my life, a large part of my life, an obsession.
You just basically answered my next question, which was going to be, give us my 30-second bio of Mark. So I think you just did that, unless you want to add anything to that 30 seconds.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say that I'm a theatre addict. That's what I would say first and foremost. I have many addictions in my life. I'm an obsessive person. If I do something, I always do it to excess. My professional life has been, the last 20 years of my professional life has been as a theatre critic, full-time professional critic. And the main reason I would say I do that is because my life would simply be unsustainable as a theatre addict if I had to pay for every ticket. I will go to the theatre between in normal times, obviously not now. I'll go to theatre between 6 and 12 times a week. Wow. I will go every single night that I can, and sometimes 5 matinees. Now, that's not always me working. That's sometimes me just going for pleasure. It's kind of an anomaly that I'm the theatre critic who goes to the theatre for pleasure, because obviously, by and large, you know, when you're in work mode, you're there with a critical hat on. But I love the theatre unashamedly, and for me, it's a passion project, and I do love it, but I obviously don't love it unreservedly, because one of the parts of loving something like I do is you want it to be good, and you can't allow it not to be good. And it's not always going to be good, but you sort of have a responsibility as a critic to your audience, namely your readers, to steer them to the right things.
Very good. So let me take it back first. When it all began, were you always into musical theater or theater in general? Was that something you grew up with as a kid, or is that something you discovered a little bit later?
I grew up in South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa, so we didn't have that much theatre there. There was a little bit of theatre, but not very much. I discovered musicals theatre through soundtracks, through original cast albums. And I never forget buying my first serious cast album was when I bought the album for a chorus line. I must have been 13 or 14 at the time in Johannesburg, and fell in love with the show. Sight unseen, obviously, because obviously it was the days of albums when you had those you had more pictures, there was more visual.
Yes.
You had gatefold albums and things like that, so it was fantastic. And there were a few South African musicals that were done. There were a couple of producers who used to do them, and one of whom was a couple called Des and Dawn Lindbergh, and they brought a Broadway musical to London, to Johannesburg, called Pippin. And this must have been, well, I left England. I left South Africa in 1979. And Pippin opened on Broadway in 72. So it was sometime between 72 and 79. So it was still a fresh show.
Yeah.
And I remember they released a cast album of it too. And it is a spectacular cast album. It's still one of my favorite scores to this day. So I bought that album too. So it was albums that led me to musical theatre. I arrived in England in 1979. The first, I was 16 at the time, and the first show I went to see was the very last matinee of A Chorus Line at Drury Lane. It's the day it was shutting shop. So I arrived just in time to see it close. And this is another thing I'll never forget. I bought a ticket for 50 pence, basically less than $1, in the balcony. But because it was the last matinee, the house wasn't entirely open. They moved everybody downstairs. So I watched the show from the back of the orchestra.
Wow, nice. That's a good way to start
Yeah.
your career. Now, putting on your theater critic's hat, was it as good as you thought it was compared to the album? You've been listening to it so many times that it
course.
doesn't live up to the expectation.
Well, one thing about Chorus Line, of course, because it's a show I'm still to this day I'm in love with, but the album only gives you 3/4 of the story, half the story, I would say, because actually there's the book, which is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary book, an extraordinary way it tells the story of those dancers' lives, and then also the key thing of that production is, and why it's indelible, is Michael Bennett's direction and choreography. I mean, it's one of the musical theatre masterpieces. They revived it in London a few years ago, with obviously under in Michael Bennett's original production. Bayok Lee now oversees she was in the original cast. Bayok Lee was one of the original dancers, and she's basically spent her life recreating chorus lines around the world. But they had a superb London star cast at the London Palladium, and I was going like every week. I was so obsessed with it because just watching pure theatre magic unfolding in front of your eyes, the way the dissolves would happen in that production, it was extraordinary. And it had an amazing woman called Lee Zimmerman playing Sheila, who was extraordinary, and just the cast were just amazing in London. I've seen other productions of Chorus Line, and they haven't been as good. It was a Broadway revival that wasn't nearly as good. And of course, one of the other things is that I'm not usually a fan of productions that musicals that lock into the original production and just endlessly, you're not allowed to see another version of that choreography.
Yeah.
Well, with Chorus Line, you don't want to see another version of that choreography. There's no reason to. I do think that with the old, I'm glad that with the old Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, for instance, now we are allowed another version. We don't have to do Agnes de Mille anymore.
Yeah. Well, let's veer off, because I wasn't going to go in this direction, but you brought this up, that when shows lock into the original choreography, Phantom, for example, they, from what I remember, they're talking about maybe restaging things and things like that, or is it Les Mis?
No, Les Mis has done it, yes. But Phantom was talking about it. Now, the thing about Phantom, it is that is another remarkable piece of work. It's run obviously for 36 years in London until the pandemic, 35 years in London until the pandemic shut it down, and they've loaded the show out of the Her Majesty's Theatre. There's Karen McIntosh has done something rather extraordinary with his career in life, I think, which is that. For a brilliant man who's reinvented musical theatre and done so much, he is consistently seeking to undermine his own legacy. So, for instance, I know this is a controversial view, but and probably we'll get into trouble for this, but I think it's worth saying this, that why you have a magnificent production of Les Miserables, absolutely magnificent. The original production was stunning, and it was filmic, it was cinematic. Fluid, the sets, John Napier's sets were extraordinary. Why then bring in a new production that basically is restaged by two people who used to be in the cast of the show, so they're not like number one talents in the world, and basically they put on a knockoff version of the original production. I mean, it's still a spectacular musical, don't get me wrong, but it's not what the original production was. So and of course the whole point is just to cut costs, because you don't have to pay the royalties that you used to pay. Yeah. And of course the product now has its own life and legacy, and people go and see it, and they're happy to see it in whatever version you present it to them in. But with Phantom is another remarkable one-off production that Hal Prince and Maria Bjornsson, the designer in particular, and Ginny Lin, the choreographer, created pure theatre magic, and there's no reason to overhaul it. And so Andrew Webber and Karen McIntosh, who are the original co-producers, I mean, Lloyd Webber obviously has a huge creative stake because he wrote it. Yeah. His company also co-produced the original production. They are deadly rivals on and off stage, and Cameron has been determined to replace the original production because he's got a cheaper touring version out there. And Andrew has actually said publicly that he wants the original production to come back if and when it comes back. So let's hope that it is the original production that comes back and not the tour. It's not as good.
I don't mind restaging. If the Phantom gets restaged, that's one thing. I have no problem with that eventually, but there needs to be a break, right? You can't just go, and then all of a sudden it gets restaged. for no
I mean,
reason.
obviously, the other thing is, musicals. Look at Shakespeare. I mean, as a theatre critic,
Oh, yeah.
I probably see Hamlet and King Lear 2 or 3 times a year, every year in England. Okay, I do see those plays repeatedly.
Yeah.
And of course, part of the reason why those plays are restaged repeatedly is that when an actor gets to between 30 and 50, he wants to play Hamlet. When an actor gets to between 60 and 90, he wants to play King Lear. Basically, those are the roles they want to play. Yeah. So you get an actor who reaches that age and wants to do it. And of course, our interest in going to see those plays is really to see those actors doing it. That's why you keep going back. Sure. And by the same token, so we do, I don't think repertoire is locked in stone forever. I mean, you wouldn't want to see the original production of Hamlet right now. I'm sure it's very different to how we would stage it today. But with these original classics, I feel there's a difference. I mean, I love seeing, for example, one of the productions of my entire life, or 2 of the productions of my entire life. One was Carousel at the National in 1992. Obviously, I wasn't around for the original production in 1947, 45 was the original production. I wasn't around for the original production of Carousel. But that production in 92 by Nick Heitner, with Kenneth Macmillan choreography, was completely revelatory. One of the productions of my life. You want to see a new look on a show. That's absolutely essential. Yes. And the other show that I always cite, and I just think this is extraordinary, is the original production of Maury Yeston's 9 on Broadway. This is one of the great sadnesses of my life. I think Tommy Tune is a complete genius. I have only ever seen the whole show at Lincoln Center Library on video in New York, because you can go and watch the shows on video in New York. Because the original production was my very first trip to New York ever in 1983. I was a student at Cambridge University and went to Broadway, and I didn't have the money to afford to see everything. Yeah. So what I did on that trip, and this is an eternal regret, is I half-timed a few shows. I went in at the interval, classic old routine. So I saw the second act of 9. And to this day, I regret I didn't see the whole thing. However, I have to say, I saw the video, and this is an amazing, his original production was amazing. All those cubes and the black and whiteness of it was extraordinary. However, about 10 years ago, probably, there was a production on Broadway, a revival on Broadway with Antonio Banderas. Yes. That a British director called David Laveau directed. Now, Laveau had actually done a production of 9 at the Donmar Warehouse in London first, before he did the Broadway one. But the one in London was not good because, of course, the whole point of 9 is you have to have an incredibly charismatic Guido. Unless you have Guido at the top of his game, the show would fall apart. He had a guy in London who just wasn't up to the role, unfortunately. So the show did not work in London. But he'd done a dry run for the production, so to speak, because the show, his version was kind of extraordinary. It flooded the stage with water. And then he did this production on Broadway of the same show and nailed it with Antonio Banderas in the show. It was the most extraordinary production, revival I've ever seen of a classic, of an old musical. And also, there was a heart-stopping moment in the show, absolutely heart-stopping. At the end of Act 1, where the show's about old Guido, and he's now 40 in the original show. Yeah. In the movie, they made him 50 because Daniel Day-Lewis was older, but he's reaching a midlife crisis, and professional crisis and personal crisis because he's having affairs, etc., and his life's falling apart. A nervous breakdown on stage, basically, the show. And at the end of Act 1, he meets young Guido, his younger self, on a beach in Italy, and young Guido scoops up some sand out of on the beach, and he opens his hands, and the sand starts falling through his hands. As the sand started falling through his hands, older Guido runs in and catches the sand. And then there's blackout, and that's the end of Act 1. I burst into tears. This is one of the purest theatrical gestures I've ever seen in my life, because the whole show is in that moment. The entire show, an older man looking at his younger self and realizing his life's it's this Folly's story too. Folly, I mean, I'm so attracted to musicals about regret and missed opportunities. But it's that story. It's the story of a man seeing his life, what's going to come of his life. And so now that moment wasn't in the original Tommy Tune production. That moment was in David LeBeau's production.
Mhm.
And by the way, here's the thing as well. Of course, as a theatre critic, you will never know who created that moment. Was it the actor? Was it
Yeah.
David LeBeau, the director? Was it the choreographer?
Mhm.
The choreographer is somebody called Jonathan Johnny Butterall, who's currently represented in London by Everybody's Talking About Jamie.
Yep.
Anyway, I know Johnny pretty well now, and I interviewed him once and said to him, whose moment was that? Did you create that, or did David create it? And he said it was his. But as a theatre critic, you don't know who to give the credit to for something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. You never know with that sort of thing. That's the great part about this industry. It's all collaborative, and when it meshes, you can't tell. And that's the fantastic part. So I want to take it back to, again, a little bit more about you. I'm reading about your first job in London was at Dewey Metzger's Pick, where you edited and coordinated the publication of theater programs and
Exactly.
souvenir brochures for the West End of Broadway.
Exactly.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, theatre programs, playbills and theatre and souvenir brochures, souvenir programs, as you guys call them in America.
Okay.
So De Winters were the leading London advertising agency at the time. This was the mid-80s, mid-86. I joined them in 86, straight out of university. And at that time, they had created, remember the 80s were the period of the British assault on musicals worldwide.
Yeah.
And they led the way because they were the marketing agency who created the original Cat's Eyes for the Cats poster, the original Phantom Mask. I joined shortly after Phantom had just opened in the West End. They created the Phantom Mask, they created the Saigon image.
Wow.
They were the logo people behind all those shows, the Les Mis, Waif, etc., the images that have stayed with the show to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So they were an advertising and marketing agency, but they also had this publishing side show. So they had a publications division, and they employed me at the age of 24 to basically run it, which was kind of extraordinary. I was straight out of Cambridge, and what was amazing was that, first of all, it gave me an inside track to the heart of the West End. So, at the age of 24, I was meeting Lloyd Webber, I was meeting Cameron Mackintosh, and all those people. And then also, because they opened an office in New York, we started doing brochures, souvenir programs for Broadway shows too.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I go over and travel and do the brochures and the photo approvals and all those things you'd have to do. I was just remembering this only the other day that we did a brochure for Carrie, which is the short-lived musical that ran 4 days on Broadway.
Yeah.
And I remember taking the photographs. This blows my mind, this still, because the other day it was Lindsay Haitley who played Carrie, the title role. It was her 50th birthday the other day.
Wow.
And in Carrie, she played a 17-year-old. She was 17 at the time. She played a 17-year-old. And I remember going to her dressing room at the Virginia Theatre with the photographs, the Virginia, now the August Wilson, to show her the pictures and get her to approve which ones she was happy with. I remember going to her dressing room and she was crying, sobbing. And obviously, a 17-year-old girl. She's from Burma. She's not sophisticated in the ways of the world, and she's leading a Broadway that's in trouble. Amazing! What an amazing experience. But we did a brochure. It's now a collector's item. So,
what a job for a theater addict! That is just the perfect job to fall into.
My exit brochure. So I must have edited and done programs. A lot of it was just drudge work. I mean, it was updating the casts for the endless cast changes of Les Miserables. But in the end, and this was all the days before computers, proper computers, so all the artwork was done manually. It was paste up boards, all that stuff. But I for 3.5 years, I edited maybe, I would say, probably 40, 50 brochures, maybe souvenir books, including, and my last job at De Winters was the London premiere of Into the Woods at the Phoenix Theatre, an amazing production that starred Jeannie Mackenzie as the witch and Imelda Staunton as the baker's wife. And that was my last job before I left. And because I always knew that what I wanted to be was a theatre critic. Now let's remember that this is the 80s, before the internet. There wasn't an explosion where everybody could set up and call themselves a theatre critic,
Yes.
or indeed set up and call themselves a radio station. Nowadays, we can all do what we want to do now.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's absolutely the way. 30 years ago, you would have to wait for the BBC or Toronto Radio to employ you to do this kind of thing.
For sure. Yeah.
So in those days, there were 12 white, mainly men, as theatre critics on national newspapers. Every newspaper had a critic, but basically, some of them did it for centuries. I mean, Milton Schulman on the Evening Standard, he retired when he was 84. Michael Billington, who until last year was on The Guardian, he retired at 78. And so he was on The Guardian for more than 50 years. So basically, as an aspiring young theatre critic, there was no job. There was no job to go into, and you'd have to fill somebody's dead man's shoes. It was dead man's shoes brigade. It's the way it worked.
Yeah.
So I knew that's why I did a winter's job, because I thought, I'm 24, you're not going to walk into a theatre critic job. It's not going to happen. I left, however, I knew that that's what I really wanted to do. I knew I didn't really want to be on the client-serving end of theatre, so looking after temperamental producers and willful producers and all that. Although I maintained a very close relationship with the Winters until fairly recently, because I continued to write for their programmes and brochures, until a few years ago, actually. So I finally saw this job advertised, which was working for a company called Listings Limited. And Listings Limited were a company who provided information panels about theatre, about arts and entertainment, and then eventually TV as well, to national newspapers. And their biggest client was The Guardian. They provided a daily listings page of information to The Guardian. They also provided to the Daily Mirror and other national papers. And this was a great opportunity to get in. It was a tiny company when I joined, maybe 15, 20 people. Plus a few freelancers, and it was a chance to get in on the ground floor of journalism, really, because it was a sort of quasi-journalistic role. It was more information processing, but we also were commissioned to write panels about things. We wrote a weekly panel in The Guardian. So my first published national newspaper publication was in The Guardian, of all places, but under the auspices of Listings Limited. Listings Limited was subsequently acquired by the Press Association, which is the national news agency for Great Britain, a bit like Reuters or one of those things. And it became a much bigger, part of a bigger organization. But I ended up being managing editor of both arts and entertainment and TV sections, and I was probably overseeing a staff of about 50 or 60 people, because it was a massive operation. So it was very much a management job, not something I was wanting to do, really. However, I did it for 9 or 10 years with a couple of breaks. There were some breaks because I couldn't stand it, and I left. I went back to De Winters at one point, did a year at De Winters. I actually even went to work for Cameron Mackintosh for a year, but that's another story. And I went there to set up an archive of his life and career, which has now been taken over brilliantly by another lady called Rosie Runciman, and she's set up this incredible thing. But I started it. And so I did Listings Limited for 10 years, and then came a key event in my life, I think, well, in the world's life, but in my life in particular, at this point I was already very much a New York obsessive. I mean, I would go every holiday. Every holiday was to New York, because I started going in 82, 83 when I was a student, and that's when I saw Nine, half of Nine, and et cetera, et cetera. But I was going every year. I fell in love with the city. It's my home from home, really. Yeah. And I was going a lot already. By 2000, I was going, twice a year. And I had friends in New York now. I was friends I used to stay with. And then came 9/11, and I remember 9/11 so vividly, because I was in my office in London and watching those towers falling down on the TV in my office, and thinking, life isn't a dress rehearsal. I can't do this anymore. I can't be here and watch the world falling down. I need to do what I want to do. And what I want to do is be a theatre critic. And I resigned from that job a few months later. I jumped out of a plane. A friend of mine put it this way: sometimes you said you have to jump out of a plane without a parachute and trust that somebody will throw you one. And I did exactly that. And I then, and this is very curious, I also, because of through listings, through PA, I knew lots of newspapers. So I wrote to everybody I'd ever worked with and said, I'm leaving listings, I'm leaving Press Association. And the then managing editor of because I was managing editor of this branch of the Press Association, but he was the managing editor of Express newspapers. He replied and said, can I have a meeting with you? And I went to have a meeting with him. And he's now managing editor of the Mail. He moved up in the world. But we met, and it turned out he wasn't offering me anything. He was just he wanted to pick my brains. He wanted to pick my brains about how listings worked, because he wanted to set up a listings company of his own. He wanted to leave that paper and set up his own company. However, no good deed, a good deed, it's still, I'd done something good. I'd helped him on his way. He put me in touch with the Sunday Express, and they commissioned my first review for a show at the London Palladium, which was the original production of the musical Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Oh, yeah.
And in 2002. So I wrote that review in 2002. It was one review only, but within a few months, it became a regular feature, and I carried on doing it till 2013. I did it for a long chunk of time. And meanwhile, but that wasn't, by the way, I should stress, it wasn't like the old days where if you got yourself a national reviewing gig, that was enough to live on. Far from it. Everything at this point was already, gloves are off and everybody's cutting corners. It was a very tiny bit of income. And what I had to do was have a portfolio career. And I started to put my services out to lots of other people. And I ended up being theatre critic of things like What's on Stage for a time, the Stage, the British Trade newspaper, and other places. So I was like, there was some nights at the theatre, I'd see a show and I'd write 3 reviews because they'd go to different clients.
Wow. Okay, let me ask a question about that. So you had to write 3 reviews for 3 different clients. Why would you have to write 3 different ones? Because they have different styles, or because
partly style, because obviously they want something unique. They want something that's
True.
You can't just reprint the same words in 3 different places. But it was mainly determined by length. But also, I felt that it was necessary to approach each client slightly differently. So, for example, the Sunday Express, I assumed a reader would have no knowledge of the theatre at all. So, even if I'm reading Hamlet, I might have to explain the plot. For instance, I might. Whereas the Stage was a trade paper, I thought that the reader would know the plot of Hamlet. So it's that basic. It's that basic. But also, it's also to do with the level of analysis, because obviously you don't with the Sunday Express. I would see, because I see, as you've just heard, up to 12 shows a week, not more than for reviewing purposes, but I would see 5 or 6 that could be reviewed. I would have to choose what went into my column. My column in the Sunday Express was 500 words a week. That's all I had.
Yeah.
So and I'd try and get as many shows into that as possible. 3 would be okay. 4 would be pushing it. If you try to push 4 shows into 500 words, it'd be really difficult. Because what you wanted to do is give one show a decent run at it, so maybe 200 to 250 words on one show, and then just dip into the others. Okay. But whereas if you're writing for What's on Stage online, there was no limit. So the word review could be 500 or 600 words. The Stage did require limits. They set reviews at 250 to 450 words. And they paid accordingly. So if they commissioned it for 250, you got a lower fee than if they commissioned it for 450. So again, it's adapting your writing style to make every word count for whoever you're writing it for. At one point, I wrote for a British magazine called Heat. Heat is a weekly celebrity magazine, and they commissioned their reviews at 110 words.
Wow.
And that would require even denser writing to make every word count.
How do you get something across in 110 words that,
Well, that's not the worst of it. That's not the worst of it. I actually, at one point, I also used to do reviews for EW, Entertainment Weekly in America. They used to have a theatre page there. And the reviews there were sometimes commissioned at 60 words. Um,
All you have to use the word is good or
yes,
bad.
yes,
Like at that point, what's the point of doing it?
yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting discipline, though, to make your opinion that concise.
Mhm.
Um, and obviously, one of the issues that I have around the online environment, which is a great environment, is to enable lots and lots of voices to be heard. Um, and obviously, there's too many voices, so there's a lot of noise now out there on the internet. But one of the things that one of the problems with it is that it enables people to have no discipline whatsoever when it comes to writing. So, for instance, she used to be an arts editor on The Guardian, a blogger called Maddie Costa. And I started reading one of her columns once about a show I was interested in. And I was wading through it and wading through and wading through. And eventually I thought, this is never going to stop. So I block copied it and put it in a Word document to find out how many words she'd written.
Yeah.
She'd written 6,000 words.
6,000 words.
Yes. Now, who has the time to write that, let alone read it?
Yeah.
So, it's the thing is, I think there should be a self-limiting factor to writing. And I mean, I think 50 words is too few. I think 700 is probably too much. I think there's a happy medium. I think in criticism, because the New York Times commissions to 1,200 words, I think it is. The chief critics of the New York Times will write 1,200 words. That's way too many, I think. Yeah. I think for popular criticism, for criticism that audiences are reading, not because some shows just don't deserve it. Some shows you don't. What are you going to say in 1,200 words? I've had some shows where I've come out of it and thought, what am I going to say in 100 words? There are other shows that you're passionate about. I could write about that production of 9 that I was telling you about, probably to 2,000 words. But would it make the writing any better? Would it make, of course, in 100 words, you're not going to be able to describe the moment where he scoops the sun. You're not going to be able to describe that moment. But actually, would you want to give that away anyway? Probably not. In a review, I'm not going to want to give that moment away because it'll ruin it for the next viewer.
Let's leave the critic part right now because, as you know, as everybody knows, the pandemic is going on. And that is probably just shattered. You haven't been able to go to any shows or anything like that. Because I was reading on your website that Monday, August 24th was the first day back to theater after 5 months. Yes. Do you remember, go back 5 months from that moment when it hit and everything started to shut down?
I do very well because I knew the weekend before when before the shutdown happened on the Monday, April the what was it? Monday, April, no, Monday, March. It was Monday, March the 15th or thereabouts, whatever the Monday was around then. The previous weekend, I was away with my husband. We'd gone to a friend's 50th birthday weekend. And City of Angels was about to open in the West End. It was opening the week after theatre shut down. And that weekend, I was reading the newspapers obsessively at this country house that we were staying at. And I realized that we weren't going to make it to opening night. That show I wasn't going to get there. It was already in previews, but I knew I wasn't going to get to opening night. Yeah. The day before, by the way, before we went to the country, I'd gone up to the Garrick Theatre and I'd met Vanessa Williams, the star of it, and interviewed her. And she had said, I don't think we're going to get to opening night. And suddenly the reality dawned on me. And I remember texting Nika Burns, who's the theatre owner, the producer of City of Angels, and also Josie Rourke, who's the director of City of Angels, are saying to them, listen, I know press night's not for another 10 days, but I'm really worried that we're not going to, that something's going to happen and you're not going to be able to open the show. Can I come on Monday night when I'm back in London? Yeah. And Nika rang me and she said, "You're overreacting. It's not going to happen like that. But sure thing. Come. I'll set you up tickets." And Josie said, "I'm happy if Nika's happy." And because they know I said, if you do open, I'll come back. I'll review the performance I see. I won't review what the performance I'm seeing on the weekend. On the Monday we drove back from a country weekend. We came home, took the tube into town, got to the theatre on Monday evening, and Boris Johnson had just made the announcement that theatres should close, and they didn't go ahead with that evening's performance. Now, So I missed that production. It was Hadley Fraser, Rosie Craig, and Vanessa Williams. So I missed seeing them. Obviously, at some point, this production may be brought back again. Let's hope. But meanwhile, it's disbanded. However, it was based on a production that Josie Rourke, the director, had done at the Donmar Warehouse, so a few years before. So I have seen a version of it, but obviously it was restaged for a West End stage, a bit like David Laveau had staged in the Nine in the originally at Donmar and then restaged it on Broadway. However, that evening, aware that theatres were about to shut down, I'd also, previous week, there was a production of The Last 5 Years, the Jason Robert Brown musical, at Southwark Playhouse.
Yes.
That I had seen the week before, and at the opening night. And because I am, as you know already now, a theatre obsessive, the star of it, the woman who played the girl in Last 5 Years, was a girl called Molly Lynch, was so extraordinary that the next day, after it opened, I wanted to see her again. I thought I must go and see this before. By the way, I was also due to go to New York imminently, but I thought I must see it again before the show closes. The following week, this is before the theatre shut down, I tried to go and see her again. She was ill the whole week. She missed the whole week's performances. And on that Monday, the City of Angels night, I had that day, the press agent from Southwark Playhouse had texted me to say, Molly's back tonight, do you want to come? And I said, I'm really sorry, I can't, because I'm going to see City of Angels tonight. And when I arrived at the Garrick and that was shut, I immediately rang the Southwark Playhouse and said, is your performance going ahead tonight? I jumped on the tube, went down, I saw the last performance of the last 5 years before shutdown, knowing that it was probably the last thing I was going to see for a while. I didn't think it would be this long, actually. But of course, as you know, it's also the first show that's come back in London.
Yes.
They brought it back with the same cast, so I have seen Molly again, a third time now. And what's extraordinary is that London has got ahead of the curve, unlike Broadway, which is still shut and will be shut for the foreseeable future, probably through till next autumn, I would say now.
Yes.
I mean, they're officially shut through till next summer, but nothing happens in the summer, so it'll be the fall of 2021 now, I think, at the earliest. But if then, I think. But anyway, so the Southwark Playhouse came back with a completely changed protocol. They've introduced the auditorium's gone down from 200 plus to 110 people. They've taken out there's only 4 rows to begin with. They've taken out 2 entire rows, and between each bubble, so if you're 2s or 1s or 3s, they've inserted perspex screens, so there'll be no interaction between the audience members, which feels very odd what's sitting there, but you know, is for our own safety.
So that moment when you came back 5 months later, that first show, what was that like? What was that show again, and what was that experience?
The first show back was The Last 5 Years. So,
that was.
Yeah, I was seeing the same show. The show I left with, it was the first show I saw back again. It's sort of nicely symbolic. Also, what was lovely about that is that, in fact, Southwark Playhouse is literally maybe 6 minutes walk from my flat, from my front door. There couldn't be a theatre that's closer to me. I mean, I'm very lucky where I am. I'm based in Borough in SE1, which is near the Shard and London Bridge, and I have within a 2-mile radius, I have the Old Vic, the Young Vic, the National Theatre, the Southwark Playhouse, the Union Theatre, the Bridge, the Globe, and there must be another one, the Unicorn. There's about 8 or 9 theatres within a 2-mile radius of here. Wow. It's 3 miles to the West End, which is one of the reasons I live here, because I want to be close enough to come. One of the joys of my life is that, because I pretty much drive to the West End every night when, like normal times, I will drive and park. I can park. My proud boast is I can park within within about 2 minutes or 3 minutes of any West End theatre. I know where all the hidey holes are, and I'll never tell people where they are. But the point of that is that basically, okay, it's a 25 minute tube ride if I was taking the tube, but I can be out of the theatre. And this is the old way of working for critics. I can be out of the theatre at say 10 p.m. and I'll be in my front door at 10 past 10. much as I do on Broadway, actually, which is where, because I told you about my love of New York so much, and to the point that 7-8 years ago, my husband and I bought a small flat in Hell's Kitchen. We are on 50th and 10th. So same road, we're 1 block away from, or 2 blocks from Wicked, and I can go to any Broadway theatre and I can be home at my front door within 15 minutes from walking. And I just love the fact that I can be so central. Now, the New York thing was it was an amazing thing. We just found this unbelievably cheap flat. I mean, it's crazy that we were so lucked out. I mean, there's some downsides. The downside is that it's a 5th floor walk up. So we have to sort of we have to be relatively physically fit when we get there.
Sure.
But the fact is, when we bought it for the equivalent of £160,000, which is $240,000, in Midtown Manhattan. And this was obviously 7-8 years ago. It went up a lot in value, and I think now property is in trouble again in New York because of the pandemic. But basically, it was a good investment.
For sure. Wow. So, what do you think of what's your personal opinion of the idea that you guys are over in London? You're still open. It's been fluctuating, trying to figure out things. And New York and Broadway, and here in Toronto as well, we're closed down, and we've been closed down since March, obviously, and we have no idea when we're going to open up again. What's your opinion on that?
I have very conflicted opinions on this, because this pandemic it's not to be taken lightly. We need to take it very seriously. It's killing people. It's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people more, particularly in the denial era of the American president, the current American president. Hopefully, only for another week. But let's cross fingers on that. But yeah. And here's the thing. So I have actually, because one of my things as a journalist is, but also as a human being, frankly, I'm not prepared to stand by and let things just happen. Michael Groundage, who's a brilliant theatre director, directed Branded on My Warehouse for 10 years. He's a very close friend of mine. He directed Frozen on Broadway, and which closed down during the pandemic, as you know. They're not going to bring it back even. But Michael, years ago, actually dubbed me something that I sort of almost will have on my business card. He called me the Caped Crusader of the British theatre industry, which basically was very flattering, because it basically meant that I hold it to account. Obviously, at the time I was writing for The Stage, which was a post-trade publication. So that was a very public way of holding to account. But I still feel that's sort of something I want to continue to be known to do. So, for instance, a few weeks ago, I went back to Sunday night. The Palladium reopened with a so-called socially distant performance of Jason Earl Brown's Songs for a New World. It's funny that the two shows that came back are both Jason Earl Brown shows, last 5 years at Southwark and Songs for a New World at the Palladium. Now, the Palladium had done a few tests before they went ahead with that public performance. They did an invited performance of a performer called Beverly Knight, and the photographs of that showed huge empty spaces in the auditorium. The protocols that looked very safe, and I thought, oh, great, this is fine. When I turned up at the Palladium on the night of Songs for a New World, however, every single row was occupied. They instead of having what I thought would happen was 2 free seats between each seat, there was 1 seat free between each party. And you could put your arm out and touch the next person in the other seat across the way from you. So I took a photograph of what I'd seen.
Yes, I saw that.
And I posted it to social media and ignited a firestorm, which is one of the things I'm pretty good at doing, because a lot of people said wrongly, in my opinion, that I was not being supportive of the industry, and actually that they had observed all the protocols that they were legally obliged to observe. And it had started off, the protocols had started off, the starting position was 2 meters between every person, unless you cannot do that, in which case 1 meter is acceptable, but with mitigation. And the mitigation, quote, meant They would do temperature checks at the door. They would enforce mask wearing. Everybody had to wear a mask, no exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
They enforced social distancing in the auditorium so people couldn't come close to each other. However, it didn't feel safe to me. It just didn't feel safe to me. And I said this publicly, got a lot of stick, including a musical director I know quite well, who people took great offense because they obviously people are out of work and they want the industry to return. They want things to return to the way they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw what I was saying as something that could potentially damage that attempt to bring it back. And this musical director he actually confronted me, on social media and said, "Why are you trying to destroy the industry?" To which my response was, actually, on the contrary, I'm trying to save the industry. Because my worry is, and this remains my worry, and I'll tell you how I'm mitigating this now myself, is that you only need one event to become a super spreader event, like the White House on the day that the judge was invited to. It was an outdoor event. It was in the Rose Garden.
Yeah.
And 10 or 12 people caught the virus in that event that afternoon. I recently read a story of a party in North America, just outside New York, which was attended by 80 people. It was in the New York Times. 36 people at that party contracted the virus.
Yeah.
Now, you multiply that, put 1,000 people instead of 2,000 people into the London Palladium, which they did on that night.
Yeah.
If it was somebody who came in with the virus, you could potentially have several hundred people come down with the virus. Yep. At which point, I don't think theatre will open for the next 2 or 3 years. There will not be because they will not be able to afford to risk it.
No.
Now, so what I now do, because of course the minimum, what happens with theatre, I understand why this happens, because economically, of course, everybody wants to make the most money they can. And you're losing a lot of money by taking out seats. So the minimum standard required is 1 metre plus mitigation. The preferred is 2 meters. Before I go to any theatre from now on, I'm still going to the theatre, I always ask the producer or the theatre owner, what are your mitigation steps? What do you do?
Yeah.
So for example, the other thing I did on the Palladium night that really infuriated me was that, yes, they had mitigation, but people had to wear masks, but they were also selling food and drink because they want to make the money from the food and drink. They were delivering people food and drink to their seats. The 2 women sitting right in front of me were nursing a packet of crisps that they bought from the theatre, and they had the masks off for 45 minutes because they took each crisp out individually and nibbled on it for 45 minutes. So I went last weekend to the Barn Theatre, which is a little theatre in Cirencester, and to see a production of Marry Me a Little, which is the Sondheim two-hander. A wonderful, wonderful production with 2 wonderful actors, Rob Houchen and Celinda Schoenmaker, who last year starred in London in The Light in the Piazza. They were both wonderful. And they have a no food policy at all in the auditorium. And to the point that, of course, and here's where you think, well, everybody does 1 rule for them, 1 rule for myself. At one point, I just driven up and I was quite hungry and I had an apple in my bag and I got the apple out and I started to eat it. And the woman, Asha, came over and told me, no food's allowed in theatre. And I said, thank you. I'm really glad you're calling my attention to it because I want that to happen. I want to be told not to do that.
Yeah.
So that's a theatre. I found out before I went that those things were in place. A season has just been announced at the Hippodrome in London, which is a casino, and they also have a cabaret theatre there. It's the original theatre where Judy Garland appeared back in the day, her farewell sort of concerts. And they're doing these concerts in this cabaret space. And I actually said to the producer only this morning, I said to him, I'm really delighted by your lineup. What protocols are you doing? And he said, we've chosen to do 2 meter protocols, not 1 meter. And I thought, that's brilliant. Yeah. That's going to get me going there. I'll go. Now, having said all of the above, it's still a risk. I think we all have to take risks in our lives, and I still think there is a risk, even with 2 meter mitigation, even with masks. But there are some shows that I will take the risk for, and other shows that I won't. So the way I'm now working it, because as somebody who went to the theatre between 5 and 12 times a week, many of those shows were shows I really wanted to see. Others were ones that I was asked to see. And my new policy now is I'm only going to go to shows if I wanted to see them.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to see. Last week I was invited to a production of The Great Gatsby. I just don't. I may see it in the future, but right now I'm not going to go and see it. However, I do want to. I wanted to see Rob Houchen and Celine Dion, Schoenmaker doing "Marry Me a Little," and I did. So that I was happy to go and see. But I'm not going to go and see. I'm not going to take risks for the sake of taking a risk.
Yeah, it's a weird time.
Because apart from the risk of the theatre itself, let's remember there's also the risks attendant in getting there. Now, admittedly, I drive everywhere. So, and the other day, even the night I went to the Palladium, my husband dropped me at the front door. He picked me up afterwards. But so I'm not on the tube. I am keeping it as safe as I can be. But at the end of the day, I mean, on the one hand, for me, there is no life without theatre. And for me, the fact is that during these 5 months, I was seriously, and I wrote about this, I was actually in a kind of grief. Because at what I'd lost and what we'd lost. My old way of life was lost. And I just could see no way back. And I still, to some extent, I can't see a way back to where we used to be until I think a 2 to 3 year timeline. And the reason I'm giving that timeline, without being overly pessimistic, is that even if we have the vaccine in the next 3 to 6 months, and by the way, the reports even today, the reports are that the vaccine, when it's applied, may only work for 2 or 3 months, and then you'll need to have another one. Yeah. The first thing they'll do is they'll roll it out to vulnerable people, which includes me, by the way. So I'm all right. I'll have a vaccine probably, because I've just recently had major spinal surgery. I've also had heart issues, so I'm okay. I'm probably going to be okay. I'm also hitting that age when you're entering the vulnerable. Yeah. I'm not quite, but I'm a few years out, a bit before it. But so they'll only roll it out to the vulnerable people first. By the time they roll it out to the population at large, that will take 2 years. Secondly, we're not going to go back to normal because this industry, theatre industry, especially in New York and London and the West End, is heavily dependent on tourism.
Yes.
Until such time as we have tourism back, you can't, and that's why Frozen closed on Broadway, because Disney could see no way of getting an audience back in numbers to keep that theatre show going. So I think I think for the next 2 or 3 years, we'll be fine. We'll have little productions of the last 5 years, little productions of Marry Me a Little, but to have a show with 40, 50 people, that's going to, I mean, having said that, Karen McIntosh is reopening a version of Les Mis, the concert version of Les Miserables at the Queen's, now the Sondheim Theatre in the West End this December. And looking at, he's doing the 1 meter rule plus mitigation. I'm not going to go. I've seen Les Miserables many times now. I don't need to see another production of Les Miserables that's not fully staged in circumstances that are officially safe, but may not be fully safe.
Yep. Man, you know what? My personal opinion is I would rather us take a hit now and then we'll be better later. Theater has come back from everything. We've had the Black Death. We've had the plague. We've had 1980. We'll always come back at some point.
Yeah. We've had 2 world wars. We've had 9/11. But here's the thing. So when they shut down, I remember Broadway shutting down, because Broadway shut down before the West End did.
Yes.
And they made that announcement on a Thursday afternoon, just as 6 was about to open from the West End. It was transferring to Broadway that night. And I was due to come to New York the following week. I'd arranged all my press tickets and everything for everything at that point. In fact, I had somebody staying in my flat in New York who was involved in 6, who's the press agent for 6 in the West End. And his first night didn't happen. Anyway, he's the last person who went in the flat. And they announced it on that Thursday, which was about March the 7th or 8th, I think it was something around then.
Yes.
And they announced they were shutting until April the 14th. And I thought to myself, gee, that's going to really screw up the Tony season with all the shows that are due to open. I said, but I guess I'll go to New York on April the 15th and see them all then. I really never anticipated that it would be 6 months later and we would still be in this position, let alone a year later.
Yeah.
So the amazing thing is that 9/11 happened, and I was in New York the week before. I wasn't there when 9/11 happened. I was in New York the week before, and theatre shut down for 2 nights. After 3 nights, theatre came back. 9/11, theatre came back after 3 nights.
Yeah,
we're in a totally different world now. We are in a significantly different world, and a scarily different world.
Yeah. You know what? Why don't we leave it on a scary different world? Just leave it on that moment. And Mark, there's so much more I'd love to talk to you about, but maybe we can save that for another day.
Indeed, I'm also a huge fan of Toronto and its theatre. I've been many times. A couple of years ago, was it last year or the year before? The Last Ship was touring. The production came from England, and I knew some of the cast in it. And I also interviewed Sting, by the way, in his amazing apartment in New York on Central Park West. And I became obsessed with that show. I became obsessed with The Last Ship, and I was in New York. I thought, you know what? I want to go and see that tour, because it had an actor I was really keen on called Oliver Saville, and a British actor, and Sting was doing it himself. So I got myself a cheap local flight up to Toronto. Saw it that evening on that Friday evening. Saturday morning, I had breakfast with half the cast, because some of them were English and they all wanted to meet me. Then flew back to JFK, and then took a flight back from JFK straight to London that same day.
Oh, that's a day. Yeah. 24-hour period. Awesome. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for talking to me today. It's been fantastic to hear about yourself and the London scene, and what's going on over there.
It's been a pleasure.
Before we go, but indulge me for a second, I always ask every one of my guests 3 questions. Now, there's no right or wrong answer to these questions, but there is a wrong answer. Just give you a heads up.
Yes.
So, question number 1. Who is your favorite creator or team when it comes to either music, lyrics, or book? You know, someone that group or an individual that you just love, or you have a passion for, you just find it.
Yeah. Okay.
It's never an easy question. I know.
No, never easy. I mean, simplest answer is Sondheim is the god of contemporary musical theatre. It's an obvious answer. Yeah. It's an obvious answer, but there is nobody quite like him. Before or since. I mean, he writes shows that like nobody else does. So he is my favorite composer lyricist, no question. However, my favorite musical of all time is not one of his. He's probably occupied. He probably has numbers 2 till 9 of my favorite. But my favorite musical of all time is, and he wrote book music. He wrote music and lyrics. Is Frank Lesser's Guys and Dolls. That is the biggest musical masterpiece in history, I think. There's no show more perfect. A lot of Sondheim shows are flawed, but individually the songs are amazing. Guys and Dolls is a flawless musical. And by the way, that just to bring it back to where I'm in New York. So if you know the show Guys and Dolls really well, the Save a Soul Mission is located at 409 West 49th Street. That's the address that's given in the show.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, does not exist. There is no 409 because it's actually a school playground. So there isn't actually a building that's 409. But my apartment in New York is on 50th Street between 10th and 11th. So my address is 522 West 50th. I'm a block away from my favorite musical set.
Nice. Actually, I think I might have wandered past your place when I was in New York last October, because one day I just decided I'm just going to wandering. And yeah, I think I just wandered up that way. So yeah.
Well, we're 2 blocks from the incredible new MCC theatre where they premiered The Wrong Man last year, which I saw twice. And it starred Joshua Henry. And to think that I had Joshua Henry 2 blocks from my flat for 3 months was extraordinary.
Yeah, I stayed at a hostel just a block south of Columbus Circle, like 48th and 7 or something like that. So
that's just around the corner from us, literally.
Oh yeah, I loved it because I can walk everywhere. Like you said, everything is so accessible. So, all right, correct answer on your answer. So fantastic. Question number 2: what show surprised you as a critic that you went in and you were like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this, and then it just blew you away?
so many. Because I mean, obviously, I travel hopefully. I always go to a show and think I want this to be great, and then sometimes. But there are some shows I just dread, and I dread for a good reason, and they turn out to be terrible anyway. But a show that I didn't know the film at all, but many people told me that how wonderful the film was. But I remember going to see once at New York Theatre Workshop before it transferred to Broadway. The musical based on the wonderful Irish movie Once.
Oh yeah.
And just. It's one of the most beautiful shows ever written. It's so extraordinary. It's so delicate, so beautiful.
Yeah.
And in the similar sort of style, the same sort of atmosphere, I think is Come From Away. Come From Away is a show that blows my mind too, because it's so, I think Once and Come From Away are quite similar. They're both folk musicals that are based on, have a very authentic flavor. They are shows that get under your skin. And neither of those shows, on paper, you'd think, oh, really? But actually, in real life, they're spellbinding.
Oh, you have me with Come From Away. I've seen it twice here in Toronto, and yes, just so incredible. So, another point for you, correct. So, third question, and we already talked a little bit about it. Audience members eating food in the theater, yes or no?
I think. Well, I really confess that I got an apple out before the show
Exactly.
the other day. But here's the thing: it was before the show started.
Yeah.
I think during the show, no. Frankly, where did this come from? I know, apart from the theatres wanting to earn some revenue from it, why can you not eat for an hour or drink for an hour? I don't understand it. It used to be that people go in the intermission only to the bar or and they'd have their drinks then.
Yeah.
Now there's this thing now that we all have to be constantly hydrated throughout the evening, or constantly eating something is insane. So I don't get it. I don't get it. I think the answer is no.
That is the correct answer, by the way. So, congratulations, Mark.
So I'm very much with Patti LuPone on this. Audience behaviour needs to be somewhat regulated. One of my most famous theatrical encounters of all time, probably, was an evening at the Barbican Theatre, which again, because I always write about these things, so they become even bigger events than they start out being. But there was a woman it was an Einstein on the Beach, the John Adams opera. Einstein on the Beach it's John Adams. It's 5 hours long and no interval. And
what? No interval?
No. The instruction on it, it's a Robert Wilson. Robert Wilson directed it. And the instruction is that you can come and go as you please if you need to. You can go out to the loo if you need to.
Yeah.
So during the first hour, I start noticing a flash bulb going off in the auditorium. Somebody's taking photographs constantly. And after an hour or so, but no staff aren't doing anything about it. And I only say this thing about you can leave and come and go because the staff could have gone to the row and found out and done something about it, but they didn't. Nothing happened. There was no photography for the next 2 hours or so, and then suddenly in the last hour, this camera flashbulb started going off again. I saw exactly where it was happening because I could see from where I was sitting where it was happening. And afterwards, I went up to this person and because I wasn't going to let this go, even though it was too late. I was doing to confront this person. Yeah. As I'm walking towards her, in my head, I'm thinking, I'm going to go full Patti LuPone on you. And Patti LuPone's famous moment where she screamed at that person who took photographs at Gypsy, "Who do you think you are?" So I get in front of this person and I say, "Who do you think you are?" And I'm raging at her. And then she's like looking at me really affronted, like, "How dare you speak to me like this?" She leaves. The man behind me said, "You know who that was?" I said, "No idea." She said, "Bianca Jagger." And so I wrote about this. And by the way, Bianca Jagger was a friend of Robert Wilson's directors. And she'd attended an event with him the day before about opera. And And he tweeted in the midst of made the front page of The Guardian, the story did. In the midst of the social media storm that enveloped me and the story, she, by the way, denied it. She not denied that she took the pictures, but she basically said I assaulted her. I didn't assault her. I didn't make sure I didn't touch her, because I thought if I touch her, she's gonna say that. And he tweeted, Robert Wilson tweeted a defense of her, saying, "I just want to say I love my friend Bianca Jagger." I took it up with the venue, etc., etc. This is me, the Caped Crusader, because frankly, she was allowed to do it because she's a celebrity. She's allowed to ruin everybody else's enjoyment of the event because she's a celebrity.
Yeah.
It was entirely wrong.
Yes, totally agree. Totally agree.
So if that's me, the Caped Crusader, I can tell you many other Caped Crusader stories, but that's the big one.
Well, okay, like I said, we'll have to have you on. We'll hear all these other things that you probably saw and have experienced as a critic, and going 5 to 12 times to the theater a week.
Yes.
So Mark, again, thank you so much for coming on today and talking to me and spending a little time.
A great pleasure. Cheers.
Awesome. All right. So that is Mark Shenton that we just spoke with here on Be Our Guest on Musical Theater Radio. Tune in next week as we'll be speaking with another guest or guests about their life, love, and passion. That is musical theater. I am your host, as always, Jean-Paul Yovanov, and I'll see you when I see you.
We love supporting and promoting the creators of musical theater throughout the world, and we would love to have your support as well. Go to musicaltheaterradio.com and click on the Become a Patron button, because a supportive community is a strong community.